chapter 12 brings us to what is called transformations in Europe, or changes in Europe. And the first one we're going to talk about is the Renaissance. The Renaissance began in Italy, and it's not like a set start date. There's not a start or a finish. But around the years 1300 to 1600, we start to see some significant cultural changes. And the word Renaissance itself means rebirth, born again. So when something is new, when it's fresh, when it's reinvented, that would be a renaissance, so rebirth or change. So how it started, like I said, it didn't start at a particular time or like, okay, begin. This change happened over time. In the 1300s, Europe was moving away from feudal age or feudalism like we talked about, and there was increased trade and commerce, and commerce means any type of business. So there was wealth, there was urban growth, cities were growing up. We had a lot of universities, or another word for colleges, and so we have really smart, kind of higher educated people gaining more power. We had the Catholic Church, still dominant force, but it was losing some of its power over cultural and political life. And during the 1300s, as we just learned about, we had the bubonic plague, or the Black Death. This caused a lot of anguish, a lot of bad things, obviously. A lot of people died, but it did help because it destroyed feudalism and gave us new opportunities for change. And one of these changes was urban workshops. And these were like new kind of labor or work-saving devices. Skilled workers worked in industries and made luxury goods and machineries. And many of these kind of artists, architects, and other creative people helped to power the Renaissance. So the Renaissance is powered by creative individuals. It began in Italy, and most of Italy was controlled by powerful city-states like Rome, and they had grown really, really wealthy, and merchants and bankers had money to spend on these luxuries and work of art. So the Renaissance has these creative thinkers. On top of the money to spend, city-state rulers also wanted to compete with their rivals by bringing better art to their city. They wanted better pictures, better architecture, better writers. So art was kind of a measure of who was better than the other. And education became more important as we got more detail in government and law. So everyone's being educated. It's very important. Italy had been really, really popular in trade. As far as trade goes, it's a port city, so it was in a good place for the Renaissance to start. And there was classical remains of Rome there, and the past heritage and culture helped inspire this new change. So that's also important. So these Renaissance thinkers, as we're going to call them, wanted to revive classical culture. And this culture, never really disappeared in Europe, but they wanted to put a new spin on it. We had works of Plato, Aristotle, and ancient philosophers preserved by the church, and interpret their work from a Christian perspective. The Renaissance returned it to the original sources and shed them in a non-religious light. In bringing back classical thought, the artists and writers of the Renaissance were guided by a vocab word called humanism. And humanism is basically looking at oneself. It's thinking of the world through oneself, not really through a religious point of view. So it was all about the worth of the individual. Worth of the individual. So as humanism, Renaissance thinkers studied classical art and literature into human life rather than looking at it at a religious perspective, which is very important. Renaissance writers were one of the first groups that were really important, and there was a lot of epic poems created. Dante was the first well-known author to write both in Latin and Italian, native languages. So he promoted the use of Italian to a more available audience. So we've got writers being very, very important. And two great humanists followed his footsteps and wrote some good lyrical poetry. We don't need to know the specifics of the poetry, but just know that they told stories to pass the time, and these writers were very, very well respected. Now, I said we didn't need to know the details of the writers, but one I do want you to know is Machiavelli. And you might have heard Machiavelli's last name used in talks today, but his best-known work was called The Prince. And this was a book that gave advice to rulers. It was basically a how-to for rulers. And he said that rulers should always be ready for war. And he said it's more important for a ruler to be feared than to be loved. And it sounds really harsh, but he said as long as the ends justify the means, you're good to go. So basically, if the end result is all right, do whatever bad stuff you need to do in the meantime to get there. So it's crazy, but he's really, really popular, and he wrote the how-to for leaders, kind of. After writing, we have art, and when you think of the Renaissance, you think of pictures like to the right here, just great artwork, and they mastered perspective, giving depth to their work. We had sculptures, working in stone, doing realism of human bodies, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, the Ninja Turtles of the Renaissance. Leonardo was what's called the Renaissance man, and a Renaissance man is basically like a Swiss Army knife. People who are really, really skilled at different things. He was a good painter, sculptor, architect, and engineer. So he painted the Mona Lisa. He had thousands of drawings of human anatomy, mechanical devices, and weapons. But a Renaissance man is a Swiss Army knife. It's someone who's good at a bunch of different things. So Michelangelo depicted the human body. Raphael was focused on balance in his painting. So again, Renaissance art plays a major role. So we talked about how the Renaissance began in Italy, but now, mid-1400s, it begins spreading to other parts of Europe, big cities like Germany, France, big cities in Germany, France, Great Britain, Holland. They're beginning to grow after decades of disease and war and of being torn down, so they're beginning to grow and spread these Renaissance ideas, and the printing press really allowed for ideas to spread instead of having to handwrite. We've got the printing press, we can make lots and lots of copies. Northern humanists maintained the Christian faith, but also were critical of the church and their practices. You know, as we talked about in feudalism, the church got out of control at certain points, and this one writer, Erasmus, he criticized the corruption and abuses of the Catholic Church, and that's going to be important as we move on to talk about the Reformation. But we've got this other writers publishing books like Utopia, which described an ideal society. You've got William Shakespeare, who was really, really famous and wrote plays, including Julius Caesar. So he was a Renaissance man. We've got architecture and a lot of good things spreading throughout Europe at this time. Renaissance and religion. At times, the Renaissance art and literature kind of made it rough or made some tensions with the church. The church had long looked at itself as the interpreter of knowledge and culture, and no one really challenged the church on that. So the church was kind of where you went, and they dictated what everything was, why it was, how it was. But now these philosophers, these thinkers, these humanists began to challenge some of the church ideas and suggest that individuals could understand the world for themselves without just following the church's teaching. So to say that the Renaissance is against the church might be a little harsh, but they certainly began to challenge some of the ways things always were just because they were that way. So most Renaissance thinkers remained faithful Christians and embraced some of the humanistic ideas and criticized the church, but were not totally against it.